My name is Lena Varek. I'm 32 years old. And the Thanksgiving afternoon my father read the first page of my manuscript, set it face down on the table beside the breadbasket, and told me it would never see a shelf. Was the afternoon I understood that the people who love you most can sometimes only see you as the version of yourself they've already decided you are. He did not lower his voice. There were 8 people at that table. My mother to his left. My brother Theo and his girlfriend at the far end. My Aunt Ro, who had driven 4 hours and was on her second glass of wine. My father's college friend, a man named Gene, who had come with his wife Pamela and spent most of the meal talking about a kitchen renovation. My father sat at the head of the table the way he always sat, upright, unhurried, with the particular confidence of a man who believed that honesty delivered without softening was a form of respect. He had picked up the pages because I had brought them. That was my error, if it was an error, which I am no longer certain it was. I had been working on the manuscript for 14 months, and I had brought 20 pages in a folder because he had asked to see it, and the asking had seemed genuine, and I had wanted it to be. He read the first page. He set it down. He said, "I'm being honest because I love you. This will never see a shelf." My mother said, without looking up from her plate, "He's not wrong." My brother Theo changed the subject to something about a coworker and a parking dispute, and the table followed him, and Jean said something about the renovation again, and my Aunt Ro refilled her glass. I picked up the folder. I folded the page I had been on, the 19th page, where I had been rereading a paragraph I was not yet satisfied with, and I put the folder in my bag by the door. I came back to the table and ate the rest of my meal and asked my aunt about her drive and listened to Jean's kitchen story and helped my mother carry plates to the sink. I drove home in the dark with the folder on the passenger seat. What none of them knew, what I had not said at that table or at any table in the 14 months prior, was that 2 weeks earlier I had signed with a literary agent named Carla Mehta, who had written me a letter after reading the full manuscript that contained a sentence I had read 4 times before I allowed myself to believe it. This is the kind of novel that asks something of its reader, and then earns it. Let me go back to the beginning because the shape of the beginning is the shape of everything. My father, Warren Varek, is a structural engineer. He has been one for 31 years. He builds things that do not move, and he is very good at it, and the discipline that makes him good at it, the precision, the load-bearing logic, the intolerance for elements that do not serve a structural function, is also the discipline he brought to every conversation we ever had about what I was trying to do. He was not a man who dismissed creative work categorically. He had read novels his whole life. He had opinions about them. He owned, in organized rows on a shelf in his study, somewhere around 400 books, and he had read most of them and could tell you which ones were built correctly and which ones had load-bearing problems in the second act. He used that language, load-bearing, structural, weight. He had a framework for fiction that was more rigorous than most readers develop, and within that framework, he had read my work since I was a teenager and offered assessments that were usually accurate and never gentle. When I was 17, he had read a short story I was proud of and said, "The premise is interesting. The ending doesn't earn it. You need to decide what the story is about before you write the last scene, not after." He was right. I went back and rewrote the ending and it was better. When I was 22 and in graduate school for creative writing at a program called Alderton, he had read the first 50 pages of a novel I was working on and said, "The voice is there. The structure isn't. You don't know yet what the middle is holding up." He was right about that too. I abandoned that novel and started something else. The problem, the structural problem in his own terms, was that he applied the same calculus to everything I produced, including things that were not yet finished, including things that were in the process of becoming what they were, including the first page of a manuscript that was, at the time he read it, 14 months into a process that was not complete. A first page is not a building. A first page is a foundation pour. You cannot look at a foundation pour and tell someone the building will never stand. He could not see that. He was not built to see that. And that is the honest account of it. I had started writing seriously, by which I mean with the intention of producing a novel that would exist in the world rather than in a drawer, when I was 26, 2 years out of the Alderton MFA program, and working as a copy editor for a mid-size academic press called Oren House. The job was useful in the way that jobs adjacent to the thing you want to do are useful. I read manuscripts all day. I understood the distance between a draft and a finished book, I learned the specific grammar of revision, and I was paid $43,700 a year, which was enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment if the one-bedroom apartment was the kind that had a radiator that made sounds at night and a bathroom window that did not quite close. I rode in the mornings before work, 4:30 to 7, every day, with a cup of coffee and the particular silence of a city that has not yet started moving. This was not discipline in the motivational poster sense. It was the only available time. I had a full-time job and I wanted to write a novel, and the morning was where those two facts could coexist without one destroying the other. The novel was called The Inland Light. It was about a woman who returns to a small city in the interior of the country after her mother's illness to settle an estate, and about what she finds there that she did not expect to find, and about the specific texture of a life that has been built in the absence of the people who are supposed to be part of it. It was not autobiographical in the way people mean when they say autobiographical. It was autobiographical in the way that all fiction is autobiographical, which is that it was built from the only material I had, which was the precise shape of what I knew and what I did not know and what I had needed and had not been given. The first draft took 11 months. It was 94,000 words, and it was, as first drafts tend to be, both more and less than what I needed. The voice was there from the beginning. My director at Alderton, a novelist named Sophia Crane, had told me once that my voice was the least of my problems, and she had meant it as a compliment, though it took me 6 months to receive it as one. What the first draft lacked was structural coherence in the second half. The middle held. The ending did not land the way the beginning had earned. I put it in a drawer for 6 weeks, which is a thing I had learned to do at Alderton, to stop being inside the work long enough to read it as a reader rather than a writer. Then I took it out and read it in 3 days and made 30 pages of notes and began the second draft. The second draft took 5 months. I showed it to 2 people. My former Alderton classmate, a writer named Danny Cho, who read it in a week and called me and said, "There's a version of this that is very good and you're almost there." And my roommate from the Alderton years, a woman named Petra Osei, who was not a writer but was one of the sharpest readers I had ever encountered, and who read it over a weekend and told me which 3 scenes she had not believed and why. Danny was right that I was almost there. The second draft was not the book yet. But it was the shape of the book, the way a rough casting is the shape of what it will be after the finishing work. I began the third draft. The third draft was where I found it, the precise weight of the ending, the sentence that the last chapter had been trying to reach since the first page of the first draft. I wrote it on a Wednesday morning in February, before the city was awake, and I sat with it for a long time before I kept going, because I wanted to be sure I was not confusing the relief of finishing with the satisfaction of being correct. I was not confused. It was right. I printed the manuscript and brought 20 pages to Thanksgiving because my father had asked to see it, and the asking had seemed genuine, and I had wanted it to be. Carla Mehta had found me through a query I had sent to her agency in October, 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had queried 41 agents over 4 months. I had received 32 rejections, most of them form letters, 2 of them personal notes that said the writing was strong but the market positioning was unclear, and 7 non-responses, which are their own category of information. Carla had requested the full manuscript within 48 hours of receiving my query. She had written back 3 weeks later with the letter I mentioned, the one about asking something of the reader and earning it. She had offered representation in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, during which she asked me 7 questions about the book, all of them structural, none of them soft, and I answered all of them without flinching, which told me something about what the third draft had done to my relationship with the material. I had not told my family about Carla because I had decided, some months earlier, that I would not be narrating my progress in real time to people who had a track record of misreading the early stages as the whole. I had told Danny. I had told Petra. I had told no one else. Carla submitted the manuscript to editors in January, 8 weeks after Thanksgiving. She submitted to 11 houses. 7 responded. 3 made offers. The offer we accepted was from an editor named Marcus Hale at a publishing house called Whitmore and Lane, who had written in his offer letter that The Inland Light was the kind of novel that arrives fully formed and asks only to be let through. The advance was $187,000, which was split between signature and delivery and publication, which meant I did not receive it all at once, which meant I continued at Orrin House for the time being, which was the right choice practically, and also clarifying in the way that continuing to do the ordinary work is always clarifying. I called my mother the day the deal was finalized because the deal was now a fact rather than a process, and I had decided some time ago that I would share facts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A publisher. A real one?" I said yes, a real one. She said, "Your father will want to know." I said she could tell him. She called me back 20 minutes later and said he wanted to speak to me. I said I'd call him in the morning. I called him the next day, and we talked for 11 minutes, which was a normal length for us, and he said he was glad to hear it, and he asked about the timeline for publication, and I told him. He did not say anything about Thanksgiving. I did not raise it. The Inland Light was published 14 months after the deal closed. 14 months of copy edits and jacket conversations and a publication date that moved once by 6 weeks for scheduling reasons that had nothing to do with the manuscript. My editor Marcus Hale was meticulous and specific and asked for 4 revisions across the full text, each of which made the book better in ways I could articulate and ways I could only feel. The cover was designed by a woman named Orit Tal, whose work I had admired before she touched this book, and the cover was right in the way that a thing is right when you see it and stop having opinions. The book came out on a Tuesday in March. The first week was the week that all first weeks are, a specific kind of suspense, quieter than you expect, made of review copies and early responses, and the strange experience of a thing you made in private now existing publicly in a world that is not waiting for it and does not owe it anything. The first substantial review appeared in a literary journal called the Meridian Review 11 days after publication. The reviewer, a critic named Audrey Blaine, whose work I had read for years, wrote that the Inland Light was patient in the way that only a writer who trusts their reader can afford to be. I read the review at my desk at Orrin House on my lunch break and then went back to work. Danny texted a link with a single word, called it. The book sold steadily rather than dramatically in the first 3 months. Not a breakout, not a quiet disappearance, but the kind of consistent movement that tells a publisher and a bookseller that something is finding its readers. My editor Marcus sent a note at the end of the first quarter that said the paperback conversation was already happening internally, which was not guaranteed for every title and was a fact worth knowing. I had been shortlisted for 2 prizes in the months between publication and the Vestal Award announcement. I had not told my family about either shortlist. I had told Carla. I had told Danny and Petra. The Vestal Award was the most significant prize in literary fiction at the national level, awarded annually to a work of fiction by an American author, announced in a ceremony broadcast on a public arts channel, with a history that went back to 1971. The previous winners included names I had studied in graduate school, books I had read before I understood what I was reading them for. The shortlist of 5 titles had been announced in September. My name was on it. I found out on a Thursday morning via an email from Carla, who had written, "You're on the Vestal shortlist. Call me when you can." I called her from the stairwell at Orrin House, and she said the announcement had gone out that morning and that she was very happy and asked how I felt, and I said I wasn't sure yet, and she said that was the right answer. I did not tell my family. I told Danny and Petra. I went back to my desk and did my work. The ceremony was on a Saturday evening in November, held at a civic arts center and broadcast on the public arts channel that had carried the award ceremony for 37 years. Carla attended with me. Danny attended. Petra attended. My editor Marcus was there with 2 colleagues from Whitmore and Lane. The room held approximately 300 people. My mother had asked if she could come, and I had said yes. She sat 2 seats from Carla. My father had not asked. The award was announced 40 minutes into the program by a writer named Gerald Owusu, who had won the prize 9 years earlier and who read the jury citation in full before reading the title. The citation was 4 sentences. It said that the Inland Light had demonstrated a structural precision that never calls attention to itself and a human cost that accumulates without announcement. It said the jury had reached its decision without dissent. It said the novel was patient in its demands and generous in its return. Gerald Owusu read the title. He read my name. I stood up. I walked to the stage. I shook his hand and took the award, a physical thing, smaller than I'd imagined, heavier than it looked, and I said thank you to the room in fewer than 30 words and walked back to my seat. My mother's hands were pressed flat on the table in front of her. Carla put her hand briefly on my arm and took it away. Danny was very still. I sat down and put the award on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the stage where the next presenter was already moving toward the microphone, and the evening continued. My father called at 8:47 the following morning. I was at my kitchen table with coffee, having been awake since 6. The broadcast had aired on the Public Arts channel the previous evening and had been available to stream from 11 that night. I had no way of knowing whether he had watched it live or found the stream later, and I did not ask. He said, "I saw the broadcast." I said, "I figured you might have." He said, "Congratulations, Lena. I mean that." I said, "Thank you." There was a pause of a particular length, not long, but deliberate, the kind that precedes something that has been composed in advance. He said, "I've been thinking about the dedication. I know you haven't told me what it says. I was wondering. I know you have your own plans for it, but I wanted to say that I would be honored if you had any room in it." I held the phone against my ear and looked at the window and at the street below it, where a man was walking a dog and a delivery truck was idling at the corner, and the morning was conducting itself with complete indifference to the conversation I was in. I thought about the Thanksgiving table, the bread basket, the folder on the seat beside me on the drive home, the 4:30 mornings, the 32 rejections, the sentence in Carla's letter, the third draft, and the Wednesday morning when I wrote the sentence the book had been trying to reach since the first page of the first draft. I thought about what the dedication said. It said, "For Danny and Petra, who read it when it was still asking to be believed." I thought about what it did not say. I said, "The dedication is already set. It went to press 8 months ago." He said, Of course it did." A pause. "Who did you dedicate it to?" I said, "Friends who read it early." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's right. That makes sense." I said, "It does." He said, "I'm proud of you, Lena. I want you to know that." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I wasn't right about the shelf." I let that sentence occupy its own space. I did not fill it immediately. I said, "No, you weren't." He said, I should have read more than a page." I said, "Yeah." Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "Is there anything I can do going forward for you or for the book?" I thought about that question and the shape of what it was actually asking. I said, "Read it, the whole thing. That would mean something." He said, "I will." I said I needed to get ready for something, and we said goodbye, and I put the phone on the table and sat with the coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and looked at the street. The delivery truck had found its spot. The man with the dog had gone around the corner. The morning was still entirely indifferent, and I was still entirely in it. I got up and rinsed my cup and got ready for the day. There are things that happened after that phone call that belong to the honest account of what came next. Carla negotiated the paperback rights and a translation sale to 3 European markets, a German house, a Dutch house, and a Finnish publisher named Karina Lantinen, who wrote a personal note that arrived with a contract saying the novel reminded her of why she entered publishing. The paperback came out 10 months after the award. The cover was different and not quite as right, but close enough. I left Oren House 4 months after the award and began writing full-time, which I had wanted since I was 26 and which was now, structurally, possible. I was on contract for a second novel. The advance for the second book was $340,000, which was not what the first advance had been, and was significantly more than I needed to live on and write, and I spent a long time with that fact before I let it be simply true. Danny's own first novel came out 7 months after mine. It was published by a different house, acquired by an editor named Ria Torres, and shortlisted for a different prize that it did not win and deserved to. I attended the ceremony and sat beside Petra, and we were both very still in the row of seats when the other title was announced, and then Danny came back to her seat and Petra handed her a glass of water, and I said, "The book is right. That doesn't change." She said she knew. We stayed for the rest of the program. My father bought a copy of The Inland Light, a physical copy from a bookshop, not the copy I had sent him, which I had sent because Carla had suggested sending family copies and I had followed the suggestion without particular expectation. He read it over 2 weeks, which was how long it took him to read novels he was paying attention to. He called me when he finished. He said, "The structure in the second half. I didn't see where you were going until you were already there." I said, "That's what I was trying to do." He said, "You did it." I said, "I know." He said, "The ending is load-bearing." I said, "It is." He said, "I'm sorry about Thanksgiving." I had not expected the word sorry in that particular construction, and I let it arrive without rushing past it. I said, "I know you are." He said, "That's not enough." I said, "No, but it's something." We stayed on the phone a while longer. He asked about the second book. I told him what I could tell him, which was not much because the second book was still in the early stages where talking about it costs more than it gives. He said he understood that, and didn't push. We said goodnight. I put the phone down and sat at my desk in the room where I had written most of the third draft at 4:30 in the morning, which was now a proper office because I worked in it all day, and not just before the city woke up, and I looked at the shelf on the wall where the copy of The Inland Light sat between 2 other books I loved. It was on a shelf. It had been on shelves for almost 2 years. My Aunt Ro called the week after the award, having seen the broadcast on a rerun. She said she remembered Thanksgiving and she was sorry she'd laughed along with the table, and she said it directly, without softening it into something easier to deliver. I thanked her for saying so. We talked for 20 minutes about other things and said goodbye. Jean, my father's college friend, sent a card. It said congratulations and mentioned that his kitchen renovation had turned out well. I appreciated the sincerity of both statements. My brother Theo texted the morning after the ceremony. I knew it was good. I should have said something at the table. I wrote back, "You changed the subject." That was something. He sent back a single punctuation mark that I chose to interpret as an acknowledgement. There is a thing I want to say about the Thanksgiving table, not because I have not said it already in various forms, but because I want to say it precisely. My father read 1 page of a manuscript that was 14 months into a process of becoming something. He made an assessment based on 1 page of a thing that was not finished. He was wrong, and he was wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they apply a complete framework to an incomplete thing, when they judge the poor by what a building looks like before it's built. That is not a condemnation of him. He has a framework and it has served him for 31 years, and it is, within its domain, genuinely rigorous. It was not the right tool for what he was looking at. That is a small error with a long tail, and it is also the kind of error that corrects itself. Not through argument, not through explanation, not through anything I could have said at that table that would have changed the load-bearing logic of his assessment. It corrects through the building eventually standing. The building stands or it does not. If it stands, the assessment was wrong. There is nothing more complicated than that, and there is nothing simpler. I did not write the book to prove something to my father. I want to be honest about that because the story could be told that way, and it would be a smaller story. I wrote it because it was the book I needed to write, and the process of writing it was the process of becoming the writer who could finish it, and the finishing was its own thing entirely, separate from every table and every person who had or had not believed in it. The dedication was for Danny and Petra. That was always where it was going. They read it when it was still asking to be believed, and they believed it, and that is what a dedication is for. What I know is this: there is a version of that Thanksgiving where I argued, where I explained, where I told him about the third draft and the 4:30 mornings and the sentence that the book had been reaching toward since the first page. That version of the evening ends the same way. He believes what he believes. The manuscript goes home on the passenger seat. The book is still the book. The arguing would have been for me. And I decided, in the 6 miles between his house and mine, that I did not need it to be for me. What I needed was the 4:30 morning and the cup of coffee and the keyboard and the particular silence of a city that had not yet started. That was enough. It was always enough. The building is not a rebuttal. The building is just the building. You raise it in the available light and let it be what it is, and the people who need to see it will eventually be standing close enough to see it, and the ones who aren't will have to decide what to do with that on their own time. If you were in a room where someone you loved set down your work after one page and told you it would never find its reader, if you drove home with it on the seat beside you and kept writing anyway, I want to ask you one thing. On the morning you finished the draft that you knew was right, the version where the last sentence landed the way the first page had earned it, what was the first thing you did? Did you tell someone? Or did you sit with it alone for a while first? Because I think what you did in those first minutes says something true about why you were writing it in the first place. If this story found you today, share it with someone who is still in the middle of a draft they've been told isn't worth finishing. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. I'll see you in the comments.